Only 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels even tell the story of Jesus' birth, and these 2 accounts are irreconcilably different. And
let's talk about that. So everybody knows the story of Jesus' birth, right? It's one of the most beloved stories out there. But if you actually take the time to read Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 back to back, you might notice something strange. They seem to tell 2 very different stories about what happened after Jesus was born. And as you just saw, YouTubers like Holy Kool-Aid here have even called these accounts irreconcilably different and a major contradiction. But are they really, or like usual, are we maybe simply reading the ancient text through modern eyes? For many though, this isn't just a small narrative wrinkle, it's a challenge to the reliability of the Gospels and the story of Jesus himself. So let's break it down. This is Theology Help, not because I have all the answers, but because I'm learning right here alongside you too. So the problem begins with the only 2 Gospels that detail Jesus' early childhood. That'd be, of course, Matthew and Luke. On the surface, their timelines seem to be in direct conflict. Matthew's account is pure drama, Magi, journey from the east, a paranoid King Herod plots murder, and a dream warns Joseph to flee with his family to Egypt. They don't come back until the king is dead. But Luke's version seems to slam the door shut on that entire narrative. He describes the family traveling from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to present Jesus at the temple. Then Luke 2:39 states that after they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. So it sounds like they went straight home. So which is it? Did they flee to Egypt for years, or did they head directly back to Nazareth? It feels like you kind of have to choose one story over the other. All right, so looking at these accounts, it's easy to see why some people call this a flat-out contradiction. But before we jump to conclusions, we need to recognize something important. When you read Matthew and Luke separately as they were written, you're actually reading the events out of chronological order. Neither author claims to give a complete moment-by-moment account. Instead, each one selects key details to support their unique theological focus. Now, this selective storytelling is completely normal in ancient biographies, and it's why seemingly back-to-back events can have large time gaps between them. So I'll give you some examples from scripture. In Exodus 1:6-8, it skips hundreds of years in 3 verses. Judges 2:10-11 jumps an entire generation, and Acts 9:19-26 places Paul in Jerusalem right after his conversion. That is until you read Galatians 1:18, which clarifies that 3 years had actually passed. Now, these kind of narrative gaps are very common in the Bible. Now, it's not crazy to assume there are time jumps in these stories. We already accept them in places without even thinking twice. In fact, you'll find one in Matthew 2 between verses 15 and 19 when the family is in Egypt in verse 15, and by verse 19, Herod's already dead and they're headed back. Most readers naturally assume time has passed, probably months or even a couple of years. But there are other less obvious gaps too. So if you look at the text, you'll find another in Matthew 2 between verses 11 and 13. The Magi visit Jesus in a house, then suddenly Joseph is warned to flee. What's missing is the delay, Herod realizing the Magi aren't coming back and deciding to act. Similarly, in Luke 2, you'll find the time jump between verses 38 and 39. After presenting Jesus at the temple at around 40 days after birth, Luke jumps straight to the family's return to Nazareth. There's no mention of the Magi, Herod, or Egypt at all. Now, if we already accept these time gaps in Matthew as well as the rest of Scripture, it's perfectly consistent to see them in Luke too, especially given the fact that ancient writers were shaping the narrative for their specific audience. So instead of assuming a contradiction, we should reassemble the events in proper chronological order. When we do, the picture becomes clear. So first, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. 40 days later, his family visits the temple in Jerusalem. We'll find this in Luke's account. They then return to Bethlehem, where they're staying for a time. Then the Magi arrive, which we find in Matthew. Joseph is then warned in a dream, and the family flees to Egypt. And then after Herod's death, they return and settle in Nazareth. I want to break this down a little bit more because this order also makes sense of the timing. It would have taken some time for Herod to realize the Magi weren't coming back, grow suspicious, and eventually order the massacre of the children. I mean, it's not like Herod was expecting a phone call from the Magi when they arrived. This means that Jesus and his family had likely been in Bethlehem for a while before fleeing. I think this misconception is also due to the fact that in every TV show and movie that you see of Bethlehem and the Christmas story, the Magi are always arriving like right after he's born in the manger. And that's simply just not the case if you read scripture. Now, I've actually put together a chronological reading plan for Jesus' birth that I'll post in the description. Now, when you read the Gospels with the full timeline in view, the contradiction just disappears, and you get a richer understanding of how these accounts beautifully fit together. Now you might say, okay, well that's all well and good, I can accept a different timeline, but that still begs the question. If escaping a murderous king was part of the story, why would Luke just leave it out? At first this seems like a pretty big problem, but the answer comes down to each author's unique purpose and audience. We also need to establish that omitting a detail is not the same as denying it. Ancient biographers were not like modern historians, obsessed with listing every fact in strict chronological order. They were purposeful storytellers, faithfully conveying truth while emphasizing what mattered most to their intended readers. Now, Luke was making a specific point writing for a Gentile audience. He emphasized that Jesus was an orderly, law-abiding figure who posed no threat to the Roman Empire. That's why he highlights the census, the temple dedication, and the family's careful obedience to Jewish customs. Including a dramatic escape from a Roman-appointed ruler could have clouded that message and raised unnecessary political concerns for his readers. Now, Matthew, on the other hand, is writing to a primarily Jewish audience steeped in Old Testament expectations. For him, the flight to Egypt is central. It creates a clear and powerful connection between Jesus and Moses, both escaping murderous kings, both emerging from Egypt, and both fulfilling prophecy. Matthew even quotes Hosea saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son." It also works the other way around. Luke includes the temple dedication because Gentile readers wouldn't naturally assume it, while Jewish readers, like Matthew's audience, would have already expected it. So it makes perfect sense that Matthew omits the temple visit, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't essential to his main point. And this same principle, each gospel writer focusing on what best supports their message, is exactly why Mark and John don't mention Jesus' birth at all. It simply wasn't essential to the unique story that they were telling. So instead of contradicting each other, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke can be seen as complements, giving us a story that's both a royal drama and a tale of humble obedience. Let me know your perspective in the comments below. Thanks.